I'm Dr. Jeff Kieliszewski, forensic psychologist. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Forensic Psychology. Frequently, I'm asked by subscribers to the channel to weigh in or provide an opinion in regards to political issues or politicians from the perspective of a forensic psychologist. Specifically, I'm asked to chime in and provide a diagnosis and opinion about President Trump. However, I am not going there. This is not a political channel. This is a channel on forensic psychology. But it did bring up an interesting question. And the question is, how does politics affect my work as a forensic psychologist? Now, I don't think anyone would argue we are definitely in politically charged times, right? And I'm going to talk a little bit about my experiences not only working with the laws and the changes in laws that have happened, but also some of my direct experience in working with legislators on issues that pertain and affect my work as a forensic psychologist. I'm also going to talk a little bit about sometimes how government actions or inactions can affect my work as a forensic psychologist as well. Now, most of my examples and stories will be kind of negative. However, at the end, I will share an experience of how politicians actually did the right thing and how this affects my work today. One area where politics has impacted my work as a forensic psychologist probably the most is mandatory minimum sentencing. Mandatory minimum sentences are laws that require judges to impose a fixed minimum prison term for certain offenses. And this removes the judicial discretion and prevents consideration of individual circumstances or mitigating factors in cases. Now, in the 1990s was when we saw a lot of these mandatory minimum laws come into effect. Why? Well, usually they were kind of based on knee-jerk reactions, or you could argue overreactions of lawmakers, frequently in response to media stories and coverage of crime. Now, one example is mandatory minimum sentences for certain drug offenses. So there were laws that came out, a lot of them in the 90s, that called for mandatory higher sentences for crack cocaine possession as compared to powder cocaine possession. This was in response to what was termed the crack epidemic in America, and this was covered heavily in the media. Well, it had ended up becoming quite tricky politically, because when they looked at the data, what they found was people from certain ethnic groups were more likely to use certain types of drugs. So then this introduced allegations of ethnic or racial bias in the laws and in sentencing. This also made the prison population explode, by the way, and we ended up spending a lot of our tax money building prisons during the 90s. All right, another example of how mandatory minimum sentences affected my work was in response to several high-profile media stories in the 1990s about juveniles committing violent crimes. There was kind of a sociological response or phenomenon that's often written about as the, quote, the myth of the juvenile predator, end quote, and this was perpetuated heavily in the media. Of course, politicians jumped on this bandwagon, and a lot of laws changed pertaining to juvenile justice and sentencing. A lot of the laws changed and made it easier to charge juveniles as adults. Of course, the politicians' response ignored the actual data that we have pertaining to juvenile crime and what was going on in the data in juvenile crime at that time. The big one was juvenile lifers. We saw a huge spike of juveniles being sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Now, these were, usually or always murder cases, but often the juvenile was not even the one who pulled the trigger. So there were many cases where we had 15 and 16-year-olds that were driving a getaway car in a robbery when older individuals went into a liquor store or a convenience store, robbed the place, and shot the clerk. Now, in those cases, everyone involved in the crime got life in prison without parole frequently as a mandatory minimum sentence. This eventually led to the United States Supreme Court in a case called Miller v. Alabama, where they found that sentencing a juvenile to life without parole was unconstitutional, and that these juveniles, many of them adults who have served several years in prison, had to be resentenced. So I've done several forensic psychological evaluation for these juvenile life or resentencing cases. I have a video on the channel that explains these types of evaluations. So if that's an interest to you, go check it out. Now, let me start it this way. If you've seen in my other videos, we define forensic psychology as application of psychological science to the legal system. So when new laws come out that impact the court system, it often directly impacts my work. I could give you a few examples. I'll give you this example pertaining to sex offender registry acts. And I'll give you a personal story about my work with politicians. When I was a graduate student at the University of Iowa in the 1990s, there were a lot of these sex offender registry acts that were just coming online then. Now, I was working on my dissertation about convicted sex offenders of children, and I was working on my dissertation at Iowa Department of Corrections Prison, where I worked. I get a call one day from a state representative in Iowa who asked me to come speak to her group. She had a group that was working on a law about developing a sex offender registry and other matters about how the courts should handle sex offenders. So I went to this meeting with these legislators and presented parts of my research that I was doing. I also talked a lot about some of the laws that were already developed around the country, some of the good things in these laws, some of the things that weren't so good, and really provided a lot of information based on my understanding of this population, sex offenders, and the research on this population, a risk to reoffend, community corrections management versus prison, treatment, what treatment works, are some people not amenable to treatment, things like that. So then I graduated and leave the state of Iowa, and I went to work for the Federal Bureau of Prisons in Kentucky. I talked to some of my friends I had back in Iowa that were still working at the prison where I worked and conducted my research. So what happened? Well, after that meeting and after I left, the politicians that I talked to really didn't follow much of what I had educated them about or what I had advised them of. And what they did is they allocated $2 million to build a treatment facility for sex offenders at the prison where I had worked. And in the law it said this building can only be used for that program. Well, the first year of the program, only 3 inmates qualified for the program because they wrote the law and the guidelines so restrictive, and as they were writing them, different politicians were adding into the law, showing their tough on crime approach. So they made it so there were very few inmates who actually qualified for the treatment, and then the prison officials had to sit there and look at an empty building that they probably had plenty of use for. Other examples of how politicians' poor writing of laws affects my work includes a law we have here in Michigan called the Sexual Delinquent Act. This law is a law that pertains to sentencing of sex offenders. It's poorly written, and the way it's applied often is problematic. So I have had a lot of referrals for evaluations because of this law. The other odd law that was passed here in Michigan pertains to what a person can do if they are denied a concealed weapons permit due to their criminal history or past mental health problems. So, guns, politics, get the picture? Got very political very quick. Anyway, this law is just bizarre. It's vague, it's weird, and I won't go near it. I won't do any of these types of evaluations just because the law is written so weird and odd and vague. Okay, do politicians get it right? Well, yes, they do. Here is an example. When I started in private practice 24 years ago here, we did not have a statute specific to juvenile competency to stand trial. We had to apply the adult statute in juvenile cases. This was a problem because juvenile competency is very tricky. It's a very complicated issue, as you can imagine. And the adult statute just did really not fit well. Well, around 2011, 2012, a group of legislators did the right thing. They brought in experts in juvenile justice and looked at how other states were dealing with this issue. And as a result, they crafted a law that they came up with a very good law pertaining to juvenile competency to stand trial. And it works. This particular law that we have now really takes into account and consideration the unique and special aspects and circumstances of evaluating juveniles for competency to stand trial. Then the state even offered training for clinicians to do this type of work. Amazing. So they actually got it right that time. So is there hope? Maybe not right now in our political climate, but let's say there's hope. All right. There are several other things I didn't even get into about how politics has affected my work as a forensic psychologist. I mean, we're talking about some political-oriented violence cases that I've been seeing, civil cases, lawsuits. Some outside the mainstream political groups had a bunch of cases from the sovereign citizens movement. They were interesting. What about funding cuts? Government changes in funding cuts. Well, I anticipate that if there are widespread Medicaid cuts, that I'm going to see an increase in my referrals for evaluations for Social Security disability. Because what happens is if there are people with physical ailments and they lose their health care coverage, they don't take their medications, they don't get their treatment, and their conditions get worse. I had other cases, I had some cases where people lost their medical coverage, quit taking their hypertension medication, then they had a stroke, and now they're disabled. So, if this topic interests you, or if you've had personal experience with this topic, please make a comment. In the comment sections on my videos, we have some very good discussions. Please be civil, most people are, but I like to read those discussions and participate, and we all kind of learn from each other. If you're interested in forensic psychology, subscribe to this channel, hit like, do all that stuff. Pass this link along to others who may have similar interests. You can also find me on social media. I'm on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and X. Everything is under Dr. Jeff Kieliszewski, forensic psychologist. Thanks.